Okay, welcome. We have a packed house today. That's awesome. My name is Samantha Balbier. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics and the LC Hillman Civic Forum. We are the hosts of the All Angles program. Can anyone, if you've attended All Angles programs in the past, can you raise your hand? Okay, so we have some. All right, great. Well, for all of you that have been there, you know this already, but for those of you who have not been to our programs before, I want to take a moment to read you the university statement on free speech. Because I think if you've been a participant in the All Angles program, you know that the program's been designed to be representative of a range of points on the political continuum. That's the purpose of the program. And we do a really hard job of making sure that we are recruiting the most influential speakers on the subject matter. And we think that's a really special opportunity for students. So if you look at the slide behind me, as you're doing that, I want you to consider for a moment what it must be like living in a society or a culture where free speech does not exist. I mean, really, think about that for a minute. We don't. We live in a society and a culture where it is honored. And part of that historic role of universities is in cultures and societies that honor free speech is to provide an intellectual environment where dialogue, disagreement, critical thinking, and civil discourse can take place. That's why we're here. We're here to learn. We're here to learn from people with whom we agree and we can be affirmed. And we're also here to learn from people with whom we disagree. And why? Get new ideas, to understand the utility of disagreement, where disagreement adds value, because you can sharpen your position. You can't do that unless you hear the other side, right? The university embraces its role to foster a diverse educational experience for students through the free and expression and exchange of ideas. And you're here today in a program called All Angles, which was designed to provide you with perspectives that do range with multiple points on the political continuum. So we encourage you to listen. And again, we don't expect you to agree with everything that you hear from every single speaker, but it is up to us as responsible citizens to keep an open mind in order that we can learn and then arrive at our own conclusions on the subject matter. It is also the speaker's right to engage in protected speech, and it's the audience's right to listen, and those things take precedent in these events. There may be instances where you may not agree with the spoken or displayed viewpoint of the speaker, and you do have the right to dissent peacefully in a non-disruptive manner during this event. But respectfully, no one will be permitted to disrupt the speaker's ability to engage in the protected speech or disrupt your classmates' ability to also learn and hear what is being said, okay? So I just want to kind of level set there and make sure we all know why we're here and then move on to the program at hand. All Angles was developed over the course of 2021 through a number of focus groups with students. Also in the 2021 All Angles Student Survey, we had over 1,379 students respond to that survey, and we spoke to hundreds of students, either in individual interviews or focus groups. And that was really important because when we did that, we listened and we developed this guiding set of principles that are also placed at each of your individual tables. So is everyone looking at the guiding principles? Okay. Number one, the program will adhere to the respect and the value of all people. Number two, we encourage enthusiastic but civil dialogue in this program. We also require that our speakers and moderators look at evidence-based and data-driven discussion points. We build on the university's belief that there is critical importance to diversity in the exchange of and the creation of new ideas. And we also recognize that values, culture, and faith are foundational aspects of the American democratic society. So in 2021, I mentioned the All Angles student survey and all of the respondents. And when we did that survey, when we designed that survey, we wanted to know from students, what are the most important social, economic, or political issues that you feel are important? What are they? In your own words. We didn't even use a drop-down menu because we didn't want to bias the responses. We wanted to hear the words that you use. And democracy, issues related to democracy was the single number one top priority, identified by not all respondents, but the majority of students who are registered Democrats, registered Republicans, unregistered, unaffiliated students, conservative students, liberal students, and students who don't characterize themselves in either of those ways. But democracy rose to the top as the number one issue. And what is fundamental to democracy in our country? Anyone? What's that? I can't hear. Our personal agency? That's right. And how do we have that? Through elections and voting, right? So that's how and why we designed this session about election integrity and our democracy, because it's through our votes that we have personal and individual agency. Okay, where am I? Because I'm going off script, but so here's why. Personal agency in voting allows us to support elected officials who also represent our beliefs or the issues that we feel are important, right? So without which, we don't have that democratic society anymore. The strength of our democracy is closely tied to three main factors: the operational integrity of our elections, equal access to the ballot, and the degree to which we trust in the outcomes. And all of those things right now seem to be a matter of disagreement or discussion nationally. And you told us you want to learn more about it. The transfer of power, the peaceful transfer of power, and the ability of a democratic government to function effectively between elections are closely tied to those three factors. What did our students say about democracy? So when you responded to that survey, we did word maps to find out how did students, depending on how they politically identified, respond to what was important to them about democracy. We saw a lot of different answers. First of all, we saw a lot of answers. Second of all, we saw a lot of different answers, but we also saw a lot of shared concerns, right? We saw voting rights identified as a major concern. We saw polarization listed as a major concern, and not just from like our own camps, right? We heard that from students from all over. We heard about misinformation, what to believe, what not to believe. And we also heard about freedom of speech. And we think that All Angles helps us the way it's been designed on all of these fronts. First, it addresses polarization because the program itself models an opportunity for civil discourse and dialogue. It provides you an opportunity to interact productively with one another. And it doesn't mean that you're going to agree. It just means that you've opened up a line of communication, which is essential. All Angles attempts to address misinformation because we're bringing you in-person opportunities to hear directly from national thought leaders who are in the company of one another on the subject matter. And when I introduce today's moderator, you'll also know that we have a very informed person at the helm who will help with misinformation if we happen to hear any today. And we try to do that with all of our All Angles program, is to have that in our moderators. All Angles upholds and is designed with freedom of speech, as I've said, at its core. And that's how we proceed and build all of our programs. So before I move on to show you past programs, I want you to look at the back of your program. There's a QR code in the lower left-hand corner. That is the code to the 2023 All Angles Student Survey. That went live today. So you need to respond to that survey. Not now, like wait until we're done with the session, but respond to that survey and encourage your fellow classmates to do the same. This is for all students, undergrad, graduate, doctoral, professional, and all regional campuses as well. So we really are true. We want to hear from you and learn from you. Next, just quickly, I'm not going to read all of the details here, but we opened up the session in February of 2022 with Manu Meal. He's the CEO of Bridge USA. He's a Forbes 30 under 30, 2020 graduate from the University of Berkeley, and CEO of Bridge USA. I think I said that. And Selena Zito, a conservative but local national reporter who writes for publications such as the Washington Examiner, New York Post, and Wall Street Journal. They really talked about, like, hidden in plain sight. If we don't talk to one another, what do we miss, right? Next, we had a session on understanding economic opportunity and equality. We had Dr. Derek Hamilton from the New School Milano. He's an economic advisor to Bernie Sanders. We also had Dr. Scott Winship. He's with the American Enterprise Institute, director of poverty studies and a senior fellow there, who takes a much more conservative perspective than Dr. Hamilton does. We had a session in September of 22 by Dr. Arthur Brooks, former president of the American Enterprise Institute, but now at Harvard and a columnist for The Atlantic. He wrote a book called Love Your Enemies. And the whole book is about the need and desire, the need he sees for America. He doesn't like the phrase civil discourse, but what he says is Americans really do need to learn how to disagree better. That will help extinguish some of that polarization you all are concerned about. Next, we had the session on the global demand for energy in our environment. Dr. Paulina Yarmio and Dr. Scott Tinker talked about the complexity in climate change policy. If you think about it from a global perspective, their conversation was great. All of these sessions are available online if you're curious about them. The recordings are there. Last, our most recent session was on U.S. relationships with China and how to achieve global goals. Dr. Aaron Freiberg from Princeton University and Dr. Susan Shirk from the University of California, San Diego. That was in the spring of 2023. Today, we're going to hear from Sean Morales from the Brennan Center for Justice and Hans von Spakovsky from the Heritage Foundation. It's going to be moderated by Mark Nordenberg, who you may know, but he's my boss. So everyone, just remember, someday you have to speak in front of your boss. Mark has been with the university for more than 45 years in a very, very rich and dynamic, diverse career. He's held positions, including Dean of the School of Law. He was Chancellor of the university for 19 years. During nearly 2 decades of serving in that role, he achieved dramatically higher levels of quality and impact on almost every front. Isn't that great for me to say, because you're here and we all know how great Pitt is because you're here. During that time, he also had significant impact on the region and the region's economy. That he had big impact on health and education, health and meds. But following the 2020 census, Mark was appointed chair of the state's Legislative Reapportionment Commission by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And in the wake of the deadly attack of the Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue, he became founding co-chair of the Eradicate Hate Global Summit, which is already recognized as one of the world's most comprehensive anti-hate conference. So with that, Mark Nordenberg.
I'm really not much of a boss. And let me begin by welcoming all of you, by thanking Samantha not only for her words of welcome, but for all of the work that she has invested in making this program a reality here in Pittsburgh. And also to thank in anticipation our distinguished guests who I will introduce momentarily. And also thanks to all of you for being here today. You came in during a beautiful afternoon. I'm not sure what it will be like when you leave, but it will have been worth your time to be here. I can assure you of that. Last week brought something to this country that we never had seen before. The centers and foundations created to preserve and advance the legacies of 13 former United States presidents, 6 Republicans and 7 Democrats, issued a joint statement regarding the future of our nation and an urgent call to action for all Americans. Beginning with the center created to promote the life and legacy of our 31st president, Herbert Hoover, who served in that office from 1929 to 1933. The group also included the centers created in the names of Presidents Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Richard M. Nixon, Gerald R. Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. Can you hear me? This seems to be going in and out. The only presidential center from the post-Hoover years that was not represented was the Eisenhower Center. And it declined to sign, not out of disagreement to the sentiments expressed, but more as a process matter, wishing that there had been more of an opportunity for discussion. It also should be noted that former President Trump does not yet have a center. The statement itself is quite short, and I would recommend that all of you read it. For the moment, though, let me share some excerpts that are directly relevant to the All Angles program and to the session that has brought us together today. This is part, and actually a substantial part of the statement. As a diverse nation of people with different backgrounds and beliefs, democracy holds us all together. We are a country rooted in the rule of law, where the protection of the rights of all people is paramount. At the same time, we live among our fellow citizens, underscoring the importance of compassion, tolerance, pluralism, and respect for others. We, the undersigned, represent a wide range of views across a breadth of issues. We recognize that these views can coexist peaceably side by side when rooted in the principles of democracy. Debate and disagreement are central features of a healthy democracy. Civility and respect in political discourse, whether in an election year or otherwise, are essential. Each of us has a role to play and responsibilities to uphold. Our elected officials must lead by example and govern effectively in ways that deliver for the American people. This, in turn, will help to restore trust in public service. The rest of us must engage in civil dialogue, respect democratic institutions and rights, uphold safe, secure, and accessible elections, and contribute to local, state, and national improvement. In a very real sense, the issuance of that statement could be seen as a prelude to today's program. To redeploy some of the key terms used in the statement, we are embarking on a civil dialogue grounded in respect for democratic institutions, with a particular focus on safe, secure, and accessible elections, in the hope that our own deepened understandings will promote progress on the local, state, and national levels. We are very fortunate to have with us today two individuals who have markedly different views about what should be done to improve American elections and to elevate public confidence in them. However, they share a belief in the great American tradition of discussing such differences civilly. This program then should leave you better positioned to assess their comparative positions, although you may decide that you don't want to adopt either of them, but instead will craft your own. And one thing that I need to say is that you should not believe that this 2-hour session will be the end of the relevant inquiry for you as you think about important issues. Instead, there will be more research and thought ahead. Each of our guests is a lawyer, which to me, as a former lawyer, law professor, and law school dean, is a badge of honor. And I smile when I say that, but I do say it seriously, because I doubt that without being lawyers, either of them would have had the kind of impact that is a part of their still growing legacies. Sean Morales-Doyle earned both his undergraduate degree and his law degree at Northwestern University. In the earlier years of his career, he served as an assistant attorney general in the state of Illinois, clerk for a federal district court judge, and was a partner in a private law firm. He currently serves as director of the voting rights program at the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University Law School. Its website describes him as a seasoned litigator who advocates for pro-voter reforms like automatic voter registration and voting rights restoration, while fighting back against voter suppression in the courts. Hans von Spakovsky earned his undergraduate degree at MIT and his law degree from Vanderbilt. His wide-ranging professional experiences have included work in a corporate law department, a private law firm, and government. During the administration of President George W. Bush, he served as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, where his areas of focus included enforcing the Voting Rights Act and the Help America Vote Act of 2002. He also served as a member of the Federal Election Commission during the administration of the second President Bush, and years later was appointed by then President Trump to his Presidential Advisory Committee on Election Integrity. He is manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative at the Heritage Foundation, and its website describes him as an authority on a wide range of issues in addition to election law, including civil rights, civil justice, the First Amendment, immigration, the rule of law, and government reform. If you do any research at all into issues of contemporary American election law, it would be impossible for you not to frequently run into the names of our two guests. The All Angles program has traditionally given its guests the opportunity to offer some introductory remarks. So I am going to invite Sean and Hans to come up to the stage. Actually, I'm going to invite Sean to go up on the stage, and I'm going to invite Hans to take over the podium because we literally flipped a coin at lunch today, and he claimed the honor of going first. Again, welcome to you and welcome to our two special guests.
And it was Samantha's coin, so we didn't cheat. Mark, Samantha, first of all, I want to thank you all for the invitation. And I want to emphasize something that you all have said, which is you're upholding a great American tradition, one that unfortunately has virtually disappeared, not only from public life, but from many college campuses, and that's the ability to have a civil, even vigorous, but polite debate about sometimes very contentious issues. And I think that's very important when it comes to upholding our First Amendment, which, by the way, does not include a heckler's amendment, a heckler's veto. And Sean, I want to thank you. Sean and I have done this debate on more than one occasion, including on C-SPAN. And again, I want to thank Sean for coming too. Well, like I said, we disagree on issues, but we're able to do it without thinking that the other person should be silenced because they disagree on the issues. One other thing before I speak, and that is, I think everybody in here is a student, right? Okay, I just want to be sure you all know the Heritage Foundation where I work is one of the largest think tanks in the country, and we have a terrific internship program. So if you're interested, you should check it out on our website. We have both a summer, fall, and spring program. We hire upwards of 80 interns. And the big advantage over other Washington internships is, first of all, we pay you. We don't believe in free internships. You do real work, unlike some folks I've talked to who go up to Congress to intern and end up getting copied, making photocopies. Our folks do real research and writing. And the third thing in a very expensive city is we actually provide housing for our interns. So if you're interested, check it out. I want to make 3 points today. First of all, unfortunately, we do have election fraud in this country. It sometimes occurs in our election. The media tells you don't worry about it because it's not massive. I don't think it's massive, but it happens often enough that we should be concerned about it. And it is bipartisan. You know, if you check out the database that we've created at the Heritage Foundation, we created a couple of years ago an election fraud database, contains proven cases of fraud. We don't put anything in there unless someone's been convicted in a court of law or a judge or court has overturned an election. You'll find that sometimes you find Republicans stealing votes, sometimes you find Democrats stealing votes, and oftentimes they're not stealing from each other. It's folks within the same party stealing from each other. The second point I want to make is our elections can be improved. No matter what your party preferences are, voters, and the polling proves this, want both access and security. And those who tell you that one countermands the others are wrong. You can have both access and you can have security. And the third point I want to make is that the idea that there's been this wave of voter suppression going on, keeping people out of the polls, is just not true. Look, there's myriad instances of fraud I can tell you about. I won't do that. If you want a good description of what can happen, check out the Miami Herald. In 1997, they actually won a Pulitzer Prize for their investigation of a mayoral race there that ended up getting overturned. The judge in the case estimated that there had been something like 5,000 fraudulent ballots cast. Or check out another case. This is a Indiana State Supreme Court decision issued in 2004. And I want to read you a quick quote from that because unfortunately, the targets often of people who intentionally engage in this kind of behavior, frankly, are the most vulnerable voters. And in this 2004 case, a judge overturned a Democratic mayoral primary, which demonstrates what I said earlier. Sometimes it's people within the same party stealing from each other. They overturned the election, and the judge said that the individuals who engaged in this conspiracy had engaged in what he called a predatory pattern. And who were they targeting? Quote, first-time voters or otherwise less informed voters, those lacking in knowledge of the voting process, the infirm, the poor, and those with limited skills in the English language. Now, if you look through our database, you'll find that some of the cases are just one person doing something they shouldn't. We added a case recently of a guy who lives in Arizona who discovered that he'd grown up in Florida, and he discovered that he was still registered to vote in Florida, even though he'd lived in Arizona for a long time, and somebody had cast a ballot in his name. So he contacted law enforcement to tell him about it, and they discovered it was his father who still lived in Florida who had done this. Okay. But then on the other hand, you have cases that are organized in order to really try to affect an election. And if you got any doubts that happens, look at the 9th congressional district race in North Carolina, a congressional race, 2018, that was overturned. A new election was held by the State Board of Elections because of what they called a scheme of absentee ballot fraud to steal the election. By the way, that election, it was the staffers for the Republican candidate trying to steal the election from the Democratic candidate. Aberdeen, Mississippi, Eatonville, Florida, 2021, city council races overturned. How many of you all have seen the movie Straight Outta Compton? Anybody? Oh, come on, you've seen that movie, right? 2020 city council race there recently was overturned because of absentee ballot and voter registration fraud, because a number of individuals registered to vote in the city, even though they don't live there. And the city council race was decided by only one vote. We've got several dozen cases out of Pennsylvania where we are today. And some of them go back to like there's one from 1993 in which control of your state Senate came down to one race. Republican Democratic parties were even. Whoever won that one race would control the state Senate. In a civil case, a federal judge overturned the results because of absentee ballot fraud involving something like 600 elections. And who were the conspirators targeting? The judge said Latinos and African-American voters. You want something more recent? Google a name, Mike Ozzie Myers. Mike Ozzie Myers was convicted in 2022, just a year ago. Who is he? Former congressman who became a political consultant. Last year, the Biden administration charged him with 12 felony counts. And what was he doing that he eventually pleaded guilty to? He became a political consultant and he was bribing poll managers in Philadelphia to put fraudulent ballots into the ballot boxes after the polls had closed on behalf of his clients, who included candidates for local, state, and federal offices. So this does happen. Again, is it massive? No, it's not. But it happens often enough that we should be concerned about it. In 2008, the Indiana state legislature passed one of the first ID laws in the country, requiring individuals requiring ID when they go vote. A lawsuit was filed. It went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld the law, said showing an ID is a tangential burden on voters. It's perfectly constitutional. And the court said this was justified because flagrant examples of voter fraud, quote, have been documented throughout this nation's history by respected historians and journalists that demonstrate that not only is the risk of voter fraud real, but that it could affect the outcome of a close election. And that's the key to this. You all need to realize we have close elections all the time in this country. We have elections at the local level, city council, town council, mayors, county commissioners. We have state races. Many of those are decided by a very small number of races. A couple of years ago, the Ohio Secretary of State totaled up the number of races in a 5-year period that were either tied or decided by one vote, and he came up with 141 elections in the state. The final thing I want to tell you is that, look, this idea that election reforms like requiring an ID or voter suppression that keep people from voting is just not true. And the reason we know that is we've got the evidence now for it. Some of the first ID laws were put in place, like I said, in 2008. That's when the Indiana law was upheld. A couple of years ago, the National Bureau of Economic Research did a study on 10 years worth of turnout, 2008 to 2018, comparing turnout in states with ID laws with states that don't have an ID laws. Their conclusion was that voter ID laws, quote, have no negative effect on registration or turnout overall or for any group defined by race, gender, age, or party affiliation. This year, there was a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And these researchers looked at this issue. You know, claims have been made that if you put in an ID law, it will give an advantage to one party. And the claim was it would advantage candidates of the Republican Party and hurt candidates of the Democratic Party. So they took a look at that. They looked at state, federal races, candidate races from 2003 to 2020. And they found that, contrary to what people were claiming, an ID law actually gave a slight advantage to Democratic candidates until 2012, at which point the advantage disappeared. It doesn't help either party. The one thing they observed was that the passage of an ID law seems to mobilize the voters of both political parties. So it actually seems to help turnout. Look, we should be concerned about fraud, errors, mistakes, and omissions in the voting process, anything that keeps legitimate voters from voting, and take steps to deter it. And that includes any kind of intentional misconduct that will keep people from voting. That can be done without preventing anybody who's eligible from voting. And we can do it in a way that will improve and enhance public confidence in the election process. Because if people aren't confident in the fairness and honesty of elections, they're not going to turn out to vote. Thanks.
Good evening, everybody. Give me 1 second here while I open up my notes. So I want to start also by giving my thanks to our hosts, to Mark and Samantha, to the Institute of Politics, to the university. Thank you to Hans for, as he said, doing this with me yet again. And thank you to all of you. I commend you all for being here. I think I was probably not attending events like this when I was in college. And I should have been. So I commend you for taking your time in your evening to come listen to us talk about this issue, which I'm glad to hear is at the top of so many of your lists of priority issues. I think that that's reflective of where we are as a nation. I think that it's at the top of, it's sort of at the center of the political debate right now. And that's because it's a really important issue and because we are at a critical moment for our democracy right now. I will also follow in Hans's example here and make a plug for internships at the Brennan Center for Justice. We also pay our interns and don't believe in free internships. We have offices in New York and DC, and we'd be happy to have folks apply. All right, so we're here to talk about election integrity and our democracy. And surely this is because I'm a lawyer, but I want to start my comments with some definitions. So we'll start with our democracy. What does that mean? I don't think we can really decide whether our democracy has integrity unless we agree about what democracy is or what it should be. I'm not just a lawyer, but I'm a lawyer from Illinois. So I go to Abraham Lincoln to answer this question. A democracy, simple answer, of the government, of the people, by the people, for the people, right? I think that if we want to live up to that definition, democracy has to have a few things. It has to be inclusive. It has to be representative and responsive. And it must be trusted and trustworthy. And I'll talk about each of those traits more in a little bit, but talking about integrity for a second. What's the dictionary definition of integrity? Means it's honest, it is morally upright, it is sound in construction. There's a variety of other definitions, but we'll stick with those. I submit that in order for a democracy to be honest, morally upright, sound in construction, it again must be inclusive, it must be responsive and representative, and it must be trusted and trustworthy. These traits are all important. Each of them is important. And despite what you'll often hear from some corners of the political conversation, these traits are not in conflict with one another. They are very much dependent on one another. We can't have one without the other. And so I'll start with the idea of being inclusive. This is perhaps the one that we've struggled with the most in our nation's history. This is, a country that for a long time denied the right to vote to anybody but essentially white men with property. It was only a century ago that half of our country got the right to vote, women. Many people in this room wouldn't have been able to vote basically a half a century ago because that's when the right to vote was lowered, the age for voting was lowered to 18. And I want to be clear on what I mean by welcoming everybody and being an inclusive democracy. That doesn't just mean everybody technically or legally has the right to vote, every adult citizen. It means that every adult citizen has unfettered access to the ballot. It means every citizen's vote counts. It means every citizen feels welcome and encouraged to participate. And ideally, it's one where they believe that they should, because it matters for them to participate. And that's why each of these concepts that I've mentioned is linked together. We can't have an inclusive democracy unless we have all the other traits that I mentioned. So what was next? Representative and responsive. If we want people to engage in the way that I just described, to feel welcome, to feel encouraged to join us at the table of democracy, then what do they need to see? They need to see that their government represents their interests and is responsive to their needs. If people live in districts that are a result of extreme partisan gerrymanders drawn by one party or the other to essentially guarantee an outcome, that dilutes the power of their vote and they won't be encouraged to participate. If they see that their government is actively inhibiting people from exercising the right to vote, is disenfranchising their neighbors, they won't feel welcome. They won't feel that their voices matter. And when the system is set up to protect the interests of those in office rather than those who elect them, we can't expect our elected officials to represent our interests or respond to our needs. That takes us to the idea of trust. In order for democracy to work, people need to trust in it. I think that's a common thing you've heard from everybody that's up here. They need to believe that it works. A government by the people doesn't work if the people don't think it truly represents them and responds to their voices, all of their voices. So where do we currently stand on these measures? In my opinion, we have integrity in our elections. That doesn't mean that we couldn't do a better job. It doesn't mean that we don't have problems, and Hans pointed to some of them. I'm switching my notes off here because it's not working the way that it should. So I think inclusivity continues to be one of the places where we could see a lot of improvement, right? We still see significant gaps in terms of who's turning out in our elections. Participation levels are high recently. We have high turnout in elections. That's a good thing, relatively speaking to American history. But participation levels are lower among Black voters, Latino voters, Asian American voters, and Native American voters than they are among white voters. And those gaps are actually growing in many places around the country. It's getting worse. Some of that is the result of laws that restrict access to voting. This is a place where Hans and I definitely disagree. We still lack huge segments of our communities out of voting altogether. Straight up legal disenfranchisement in many instances, right? There are more than 4 million adult citizens in the United States that are legally disenfranchised because of a conviction in their past. Those laws, criminal disenfranchisement laws, many of them have their roots in attempts after the Civil War to continue to disenfranchise black men by using the racism inherent in our criminal justice system. We still have systemic inequality in our criminal justice system, so those laws still disproportionately lock Black and brown folks out of our elections legally. The issue goes beyond that sort of de jure disenfranchisement, actually saying you do not have the legal right to vote. Tomorrow, I'm heading to Texas to try a case in federal court challenging an omnibus bill passed in Texas in 2021 that imposes restriction after restriction after restriction on the right to vote and targets voters of color and voters with disabilities. That was just one example of a much larger trend in 2021. And it stretches back before 2021. In the last decade, at least 29 states have passed 94 restrictive voting laws. At the Brennan Center, we track every single piece of voting legislation in every state legislature across the country, and we've done so for over a decade. And we have seen this huge wave of restrictive voting laws. Now, many of those laws have been enacted in the name of election integrity, what we're here to talk about today. But I think we should seriously question anyone who argues that the best way to achieve election integrity is to restrict access to voting. Again, I think that election integrity depends on being inclusive. Those concepts are not at odds with one. And many of these appeals to election integrity are made in the name of stopping fraud in our elections. But despite, this is another place where Hans and I disagree, despite what you've heard about some examples of fraud, fraud is extraordinarily rare in our elections. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. Study after study has shown that while we can name some examples, we're talking about a handful of examples when billions of votes are being cast over the years that these studies span. There are politicians who have staked their entire political careers on the idea of exposing fraud in our elections and spent tens of thousands of hours and resources galore trying to unearth this fraud. And they've proven this point better than anybody because they've barely found a thing. Rather than unearthing some massive voter fraud conspiracy, they end up often prosecuting people who say had a criminal conviction and didn't realize they were ineligible to vote and cast a ballot. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about voter fraud. Now, is there fraud by people in power? Are there the kinds of shenanigans we saw in North Carolina in the congressional race that Hans referenced? Absolutely. There are instances like that. That's not what these laws are aimed at addressing. A voter ID law doesn't stop that. It stops someone from casting a ballot because they don't have the right ID in their pocket. And it stops a thing that really doesn't exist, which is in-person voter impersonation. So then often the proponents of these bills will say, even if fraud is not that common, and I think you heard Hans say, it's not that common. It's not massive. It happens. It's not massive. But people believe that it is. So we need to pass these laws to shore up confidence in our elections, right? This is about instilling trust. And I have two responses to that. The first is, it's often the same people that spread lies about the amount of fraud that there's rampant fraud in our elections, that then offer up this solution for the dent that they've just placed in public confidence in our elections. They undermine public confidence, and then they say that lack of public confidence is why we need these restrictions on voting. And second, passing laws to stop fraud that doesn't exist, in my view, sends the wrong message to voters. It tells them that there is a problem that needs to be solved when there isn't. And if these laws were really aimed at stopping fraud, you'd think we'd see them introduced in places with more fraud or places with the lax laws. Or maybe in today's environment, you just expect to see them introduced along party lines. But at the Brennan Center, we took a look at every single restrictive voting provision introduced in legislation in the states in that wave year, 2021. And we did a statistical analysis to see what predicts where these restrictive bills are going to be introduced. And you know what we found? The thing that best predicted which legislators would introduce a restrictive voting provision wasn't their party. It wasn't how politically competitive their district was. It was race. The legislators that lived in the whitest districts of the most diverse states in the country were the most likely to introduce restrictive voting legislation. The legislators that lived in the districts with the highest levels of racial resentment were the most likely to introduce restrictive voting legislation. Now, I'm not saying every one of those legislators acted with racial animus, but I do think that study lines up with a lot of other evidence demonstrating that race still lies at the heart of the fight that we're having over our democracy. It's still a fight about what we mean when we say our democracy. Who do we mean? This is not new. Going back 100 years ago, the proponents of restrictive laws, back then it was grandfather clauses, literacy tests, and criminal disenfranchisement laws. They often use the specter of fraud and corruption to justify those restrictions on voting. I'm going to wrap up here. Fast forward to 2020. Then President Trump tells the lie that his victory was stolen from him and the election was rigged. Where does he say fraud occurred? He says Detroit. He says Philadelphia. He says Milwaukee. He says Atlanta. We all know that was not based on any reality of some kind of rampant fraud happening in those cities. That's been disproven time and time again. So what do those cities have in common? Those cities are large concentrations of people of color in states that are not so diverse. The irony of those claims is that while Trump is spreading this lie, he's the one perpetrating what is the most extreme corrupt attempt to overturn an election in our history. So that is the true threat that our democracy faces. We do have work to do. I don't want to pretend that everything is hunky-dory here. The threat, though, are the people who would deny elections, who would deny the result of our elections, people who sow mistrust in our elections and question the validity of votes of certain communities for their own political gain. We survived that attempt in 2020. Trump's own administration called that the most secure election in our nation's history. And I think that proves that we do have election integrity. We have a democracy that is resilient. But we also just saw how much it's come under threat in recent years. So we should be focusing our efforts on trying to stop that kind of fraud, not phantom fraud that is so often the focus of people who claim to be acting in the name of election integrity. Sorry if I went over my time, but thank you so much.
Well, Samantha at lunch was worried that I was going to have trouble parsing out areas of disagreement between our two speakers. I guess that's not going to be my challenge. And let me go to you, Hans, and let's just pick up with what Sean ended his remarks on. If there is diminished confidence in American elections today, is that a product principally of real problems, or is it a product principally of disinformation?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that. You know, I mean, I don't know. Sean always brings up the 2020 election. What I was talking about was actual fraud that really happened. That's the only thing we put in our database. And I'm not. There were a lot of invalid claims made about the 2020 election, but then there were a lot of invalid claims made about the 2016 election, right? You know, we've had Hillary Clinton claiming that the 2016 election was stolen. We have Donald Trump claiming that the 2020 election. A lot of losing candidates make those claims. Okay, but what I deal with is claims where there's actual evidence of a problem. Now, the one thing I'll tell you about this, two things. One, when the Supreme Court upheld Indiana's voter ID law, they made a point of saying that public confidence is extremely important in turnout and getting people to vote. And second, I want to give, if I can, just a quick example of this. In the 1990s, a losing African-American Democratic candidate called the Justice Department. He lived in a county in Alabama. He called because he said this was a county entirely controlled by one party. And he was running as a reformer because he said that the county government was corrupt. And he was running as a reformer, and he called up the Justice Department, the Clinton Justice Department, and said, look, I think my election's been stolen. The FBI launched a huge investigation, went down there, and eventually indicted, successfully convicted almost a dozen local individuals for engaging in a massive absentee ballot fraud. His election had been stolen. The point of this story is that, look, this is a county that's something like 80% African American. And all these groups, including the SCLC and others, said, you shouldn't be down here investigating this. You're trying to intimidate voters. They're not going to vote because you're down here doing this. The FBI persisted, the Clinton Justice Department persisted, they convicted these locals. And you know what happened to turnout in that county after those convictions? Turnout went up. And the reason for that clearly was that people once again had confidence in the outcome of the elections there. And I think that's a prime example of how when you actually go after real cases of this, you can improve turnout and public confidence.
Well, I'm going to have, well, Sean, do you want to say something? You looked like you did.
Sure. I guess I would just say, I agree that we should actually go after and prosecute real cases of fraud. I don't think we have a problem doing that. I think that's the takeaway I take from that story. We already have laws that make it illegal to commit fraud in our elections. They're already enforced. There are examples of people getting arrested and prosecuted and convicted. That doesn't, to me, justify a whole other set of laws now being enacted, which don't make something criminal that didn't that don't solve a problem that needs to be solved. You know, one of the pieces of SB1 in Texas that we temporarily got enjoined, but the case went moot, was a law that makes it a crime for election officials in Texas. It is a crime in Texas for election officials to encourage people to vote by mail. I just don't understand how that is aimed at addressing fraud. When people commit fraud, we can arrest them, we can convict them, and we can prosecute them, but that doesn't prove that it's a rampant problem that needs to be fixed.
Well, I know that people get tired of talking about the 2020 election, but it does loom as a large problem in terms of the feelings of Americans, the confidence in the election system, and the polarization of the country. One of our former Republican governors, Tom Corbett, said, despite the absence of even the slightest evidence of any widespread fraud or systemic problems in 2020, the relentless efforts to deny the results of the 2020 election undermine the nation's faith in our ability to conduct fair, transparent, and honest elections in the future. Now, I know because I've heard you say it, that you don't think there was widespread fraud in that election.
No, Joe Biden is properly the president. I think the one thing that we should get out of people should quit arguing about the 2020 election, okay? We've got elections coming up, and what people should be concentrating on, Sean, I think you probably would agree with me, what we will need to be concentrating on is making sure that in future elections, people have access, they're able to get in to vote, and that we have the kind of rules and regulations in place to make sure that errors, omissions, mistakes, and intentional misconduct don't prevent people from voting. And to me, what that means is you can take lessons out of the 2020 election and try to fix things, holes in the system and problems that we think are there. Now, we disagree on what some of those problems are, but I think what we need to do is we're supposed to be looking forward at upcoming elections and try to work out how those elections are going to be run ahead of time so that we're not put in a position of arguing after the election is over whether it was correctly decided. What the system we want is a system in which after the election, everybody involved, including the losing candidate, says, you know, I lost the election, but it was a fair election.
Which, though there are exceptions, used to be the way it pretty much was done. And people did accept the results and they did go on. Let me ask you one more question, if I can, Sean, which picks up again on something that, or Hans, that Sean said. I do hope people will go and look at the Heritage Foundation website and look at their catalog of voting fraud cases that have been recorded after conviction or a guilty plea. But what should we make of those examples when we do have this much larger universe of elections and votes cast as context?
You want me?
Yeah, because I think Sean's already said what he thinks.
Well, one of the issues with that is that there's a lot more stuff out there than that is not in our database. Okay, and if I can, I'll give you, if I can find it very quickly, I'll give you some numbers on this. A couple of years ago, an organization called the Public Interest Legal Foundation did something that nobody's really done before. Okay, they purchased or obtained the voter registration lists from 42 states, which included voter histories. Now, those voter lists, many of them are filled with errors and omissions, and you have to enhance the data if you actually want to do any kind of comparison work. And one of the problems that's occurred since 2020 is all these amateurs have gotten into this. They don't know what they're doing. And what I mean by that is, if all you have is the name of an individual, John B. Smith, and his birth date, you're not going to know whether the John B. Smith with that birth date who's registered in Alabama is the same John B. Smith with that birth date in Arizona, because you'd be amazed at how many people have the same name and the same birth date. So what they did is they enhanced the data by going to commercial data houses, credit agencies. You all would be scared if you knew how much credit agencies know about you. And the point of that was to get a unique identifier on every single registered voter in all these 42 states. And then they compared the data. They found that in the 2016 and 2018 election, there were 15,000 individuals who were credited by the states with voting, even though they were dead. There were 8,400 people who had voted in 2 different states in the 2018 election. There were 81,000 registered voters who were registered twice at the same address and voted twice in 2016 and 2018 without election officials realizing the problem. And there were other cases like this. Basically, there were 144,000 potential cases. And when that report came out in 2020, not a single law enforcement agency and not a single Secretary of State anywhere in the country asked them for the report or the data so they could investigate and see whether this was accurate or not. If they had, our database would be a heck of a lot larger.
Sean?
Well, I haven't examined PILF's study, but I do think that I agree with Hans that there are way too many amateurs engaged in attempts at comparing voter records and making conclusions about potential cases, and then drawing conclusions from them to suggest that there was rampant fraud. The reality is that election officials are required by federal law to do the work to actually make real matches and make real decisions to keep voter rolls clean. And I do think there's work to improve on that. But the fact that we have duplicates across states, or people identify, non-election officials identify what they think are examples of fraud, does not mean that there actually was fraud. When election officials have conducted these kinds of investigations, they've uniformly decided that fraud is extremely rare. And when amateurs and non-election officials have submitted mass challenges in places like Georgia, doing their own database matching in order to try to prove that people are improperly registered, they've almost uniformly, those challenges have almost uniformly been rejected because they're not actually using the data correctly. And I think PILF has on occasion accused people of being registered incorrectly, or and turned out to be wrong about that. So I can't engage with this particular study because I haven't examined it, but I don't believe that that fraud is rampant. And I think every study that's ever been conducted to try to answer that question comes out on my side of the
Well, I can't engage with a Gallup poll here, which said that 80% of Americans favor photo ID requirements. That includes a majority of Democrats, and it includes nearly 80% of people of color. If that's the case, why don't you just give in on that one and do something to elevate the confidence in the process?
So the Brennan Center doesn't oppose voter ID laws, and we never have. The Brennan Center, the fact is that when we talk about voter ID laws, we're all talking about different things. It's not just one thing. There's not just a voter ID law and you're either for it or you're against it. It's much more complicated than that. Maybe not much more complicated. It's a little more complicated than that. There are voter ID laws, and then there are voter ID laws. There is currently a requirement under federal law that people show ID in certain circumstances in every state in the country. We're not opposed to that. But some voter ID laws are particularly restrictive. They require certain kinds of ID that are not held by everybody and not equally available to everybody. They don't provide people options if they don't have those particular forms of ID. And the most restrictive voter ID laws that really have limited lists and limited options have actually been rejected by courts, unlike the Indiana law back in 2008 that Hans mentioned. And so most of the laws that we have around the country don't fall into that worst category. But we get engaged in this debate over, are you for or against ID laws? And it misses the point, and it confuses the conversation. Of course, people are in favor of the abstract concept of ID law, but that's not actually answering the question of whether they're in favor of a law that requires an ID that many people don't have in their state, that disproportionately disenfranchises certain communities, and that doesn't provide people with an option when they don't have an ID available to them. And that's what we're opposed to.
Is there a good photo ID law that you think could stand as a model for other states?
I think that the Freedom to Vote Act last year, which actually was reintroduced this year, last Congress and this Congress, includes a requirement for, if a state enacts a voter ID law, what that ID law must contain. That I think is worth looking to. It requires states to allow a very wide range of legitimate IDs from voters, and it requires them to provide people opportunities if they lack the ID available, or the lack the ID required by the list. So that's where I'd start.
Hans?
Sean keeps talking about restrictive laws. That's the way voter ID laws have been referred to now for years. Sorry, but the turnout data is conclusive on this. photo ID laws, including the ones that he considers too restrictive, which require a government issued photo ID, don't keep people from voting. And by the way, every state that has put in an ID law provides a free ID to anybody who doesn't have one. Now, when Georgia put in its photo ID law, government issued photo ID, it was first effective in the 2008 presidential election. Lawsuits were filed. The claim was this would prevent African Americans from being able to vote, which frankly, I think is a patronizing attitude towards African Americans, that somehow they can't cope with this. This is the data from the website of the Secretary of State. In 2008, when the ID law was in effect for the first time, in comparison to the 2004 election, the increase in Black voting was 42%, 42% higher than the prior election. The increase in the Hispanic vote was 140%. The increase in white voting over the prior election with the ID law in place was only 8%. Now, a lot of people, when I pull that out, say, well, of course, 2008, Barack Obama was on the ballot. Actually, the increase in Georgia was one of the biggest increases of any state in the country. And in 2010, right? 2010, Barack Obama's not on the ballot. You all may recall, 2010 was actually a big Republican year, right? They took control of the US House. In 2010, with this new photo ID law in place for the first time in a congressional race, in comparison to the 2006 congressional midterm, when there was no such ID race, there was an increase of over 66% in the Hispanic vote, 44% in the Black vote, and 11% in the white vote. Remember Indiana, right? The Supreme Court upheld its photo ID law. So it was in effect for the first time in Indiana in 2008. Barack Obama won Indiana with the new photo ID law in place, the first Democrat presidential candidate to win the state since the early 1960s. Right? It just doesn't keep people from voting. And as you said, the polling shows, and it doesn't matter whether you look at a more conservative polling company like Rasmussen or a more liberal polling company. The Washington Post does polls all the time. The support for this among voters is overwhelming, and it doesn't matter what their race or ethnicity is. It doesn't matter which party they support. They all think it's a common sense idea. Why? Because they have to show an ID every day for all kinds of things. And again, the key to this is every state has provided a free ID to anyone who needs it. And the data is now in for more than 15 years, 14 years, and it doesn't keep people from voting. It's not a restriction.
John?
I'd say a couple things in response. One is, I don't agree that the most restrictive laws have gone into effect and proven not to have the kinds of results that I'm talking about. I think some of the most restrictive laws have been blocked and have never gone into effect. I give the example of Texas's law that went into effect in 2013, but was stopped by a number of different court orders from going into effect, or laws that have not allowed tribal IDs as a form of valid ID in places with large Native American populations that have been blocked by the courts from going into effect. So some of the reason we haven't seen the worst effects from voter ID laws is because the worst voter ID laws have been blocked by courts as being unconstitutional or violative of federal law. I also just disagree that we can look at the turnout in a given election overall and determine whether or not there was an impact from one particular policy in that election based on that. Turnout is a very complicated thing that has a lot of factors going into it. Whether or not Georgia turnout goes up or down in any given election is not dependent on just one policy or just 5 policies. It's dependent on lots and lots of things. And it's often more complicated than just looking at top turnout numbers. I'll turn back to that in a second, but first I'll say, I don't think voter ID laws are the biggest threat to our country. As I've said, We're not opposed to voter ID laws. It's a more nuanced conversation than that. And so having this conversation about whether laws restrict access to voting and repeatedly talking about just one policy, and one policy that actually comes in many flavors, is not really the right way to think about this. But let's look at a more recent Georgia law, Georgia Senate Bill 202, which was passed in 2021. 2022, there was high turnout in Georgia, and lots of people talked about how there was high turnout in Georgia. Obviously, Senate Bill 202 didn't really do anything. This is the law you've probably heard about. It makes it a crime to end people water while they're standing in line to vote, and does a lot of other things as well. Well, it's true that turnout was high in Georgia in 2022. There are a lot of reasons for that have nothing to do with the law. I think you might have noticed that like the nation's political future came down to one election in Georgia in some ways, right? But and there was massive resources invested in turning out the vote, massive resources that some of which had to go to helping people overcome hurdles that were just placed in front of them. Imagine if those hurdles weren't there, what turnout would have been. But also, if you dig just a little bit below the surface, you see that, yeah, turnout went up in 2022 in Georgia. White turnout went up, black turnout went down. The gap between white voters and non-white voters grew in Georgia to the largest that it's been in a decade. And so we can have high turnout. That doesn't mean we've now decided what the outcome of any given policy is. It requires a much deeper analysis. And even just one level below the surface, we can see that there's some real problems with what's going on with turnout in our country right now. And we can have high turnout election after election, but if it's not an inclusive democracy, then we have a problem to solve.
Hans?
Well, let's talk about Georgia. You know, the claims were made that Georgia's election reforms were going to keep people from voting. It was Jim Crow 2.0. It was voter suppression. In the 2022 election, Georgia's turnout was 6 percentage points above the national turnout across the country. Not only that, but the turnout in Georgia was higher than the turnout in the 3 states of the 3 biggest critics of Georgia. The turnout was higher in Georgia than New York, California, and Delaware. Moreover, the University of Georgia's Survey Research Center did a big survey after the 2022 election. They asked voters about their overall voting experience. And you don't have to believe me, you can look this up. Google it and you'll find it. Black voters in Georgia said that with these new reforms in place, 76.6% said their voting experience in 2022 was excellent. 24% said their voting experience was good. Anybody care to guess how many said they had a poor experience voting? 0%. I've never seen 0% in any survey I've ever read. They also asked voters, and by the way, the numbers for white voters were essentially the same. They then said to voters, well, how was your voting experience, again, compared to the prior election when these reforms weren't in place? 19% of Black voters said it was easier. Almost 73% said there was no difference. One final note. You've heard lots of claims about long lines to vote, right? There's been several studies done on this. Caltech, MIT, my alma mater, have done a number of studies on this. The average wait time to vote in this country is very, very low. It's like 14, 15 minutes. Georgia, where there were claims there were long lines, they also asked voters, well, how long do you have to wait to vote in the 2022 election? Among Black voters, 32% said they didn't have to wait at all. 37% said they had to wait less than 10 minutes. 27% said they waited between 10 and 30 minutes. So 96% of the voters had to wait 30 minutes or less, or no time at all. In fact, the average waiting time in Georgia was lower than the average waiting time according to the Caltech MIT studies. So you often hear a lot of claims made, but when you look at the actual facts, and I guess I can't help it having gone to a science and engineering school, like to look at the evidence when people are making claims, and the facts just don't support the idea that these reforms kept people from voting, because it didn't. I have a response, but I don't know if you want to move on.
Pardon me?
I said I can respond, but I don't know if you want to
Oh,
move on.
go ahead.
So,
And I'm going to say we want to start getting ready for the student questions. So if we're
yeah, we should.
Yeah. So what'd you say it was 90 what percent that said they waited in a line of less than 30 minutes? I don't remember the numbers from this survey, so I do remember the survey.
It's buried in my notes.
Yeah. So I think you said 96. I don't remember, but so a survey, as I recall, a survey of people who voted in Georgia in 2022, which means this is a survey that necessarily excludes anyone that was actually stopped from voting. So if there were people who were stopped from voting, they're not included in the survey. Said that the people who actually did vote mostly had a good experience. Of course, that's great. They should. I'm glad to hear it. I hope that the vast, and I believe that the vast majority of people in Georgia and everywhere in the country have a pretty normal and good experience when voting, and that's the way it should be. Doesn't mean it's a problem, not a problem if some don't. 0% said they had a poor experience, but 4 or 5% waited in a line longer than a half hour. So apparently people in Georgia have come to believe that it's okay to wait in a line for more than a half an hour, and they don't even think that's a poor voting experience. That's not okay. These aren't claims that there are long lines. There are long lines. Are they everywhere? No, they're not everywhere. They shouldn't be anywhere. And it shouldn't be the fact that if you wait in a line for more than a half an hour, it's a crime for someone to hand you a bottle of water so that you can stay on the line. And if you didn't stay on the line because you couldn't have water and you were exhausted, you're not included in that survey. So I disagree that the facts show that everything's hunky-dory in Georgia, where a federal judge just blocked multiple pieces of SB 202 for being illegal under federal law. I am not here to claim that some enormous percentage of Americans are stopped from voting or have a miserable experience voting. I don't think that's true. Now, I will go back to the fact that like over 4 million people are outright not allowed to vote under law in this country that are adult citizens. So there's certainly a lot of people who fall in that category. But the fact that it isn't more than 5% doesn't mean that it's not a problem. 5% of this country shouldn't be having a half hour wait to vote. And that's of the people who actually cast a ballot. Think about the people who were turned away. I go back to the point that yes, turnout was very high in Georgia in 2022. It was not as high as it was in 2018 or in 2020, but it was high. Of course it was high. It was high because this was one of the most important elections in the country, with massive amounts of money funneled there to get people to turn out. It was high among Black voters. There were Black officials at the top of the ballot in both parties in Georgia, which has been demonstrated to drive up turnout among both Black voters and other non-white voters. And yet Black voter turnout went down from 2018 to 2022 in Georgia, at the same time that white voter turnout went up. And they had the largest gap in racial turnout that they've had in a decade in Georgia. And this is a problem that is happening in many other places in the country. So I don't think saying there was high turnout or that most people had a good experience means that there was nothing wrong with this law. And I want to make another thing clear about my perspective about restrictive voting laws, which is we hear a lot about whether or not it impacted the outcome of an election and whether this party won or that party won. I don't care about voter suppression because I think it's making one party win and the other party lose. We're a nonpartisan organization. That's not the only harm that we experience when people are cut out from our elections. And it's not the best measure for whether or not our democracy is working. As I said, I want a democracy that is inclusive, representative, and responsive, trusted and trustworthy. I'm not asking for an election that makes one party win or the other party win. I'm asking for an election that makes the party win that should win based on whether it's representative of the people's views in that state. And so it's not okay to me if an election comes out the way it would have come out anyway, whether or not people were stopped from voting. If people were stopped from voting, 4%, 5%, 1%, I'm not okay with turning those people away from voting, even if the election comes out the same way, because it matters if entire communities are stopped from voting, are cut out of the conversation, are made to feel unwelcome, are not actually welcome to the table. It matters no matter who wins that election, because those are the people who elected officials are supposed to be responsible to and responsive to. And if they know those people aren't participating, whichever party they're from, they're not going to be responsive to them. We should have a vision of our democracy that we want to achieve and look to aim towards that, not have a vision for who we want to win and aim towards that.
Let me ask each of you for a quick comment on mail ballots, which is another area of regular disagreement before we turn to the students. Hans?
Look, we need absentee or mail-in ballots for people who can't make it to a polling place because they're physically disabled, because maybe they're serving in the military overseas. The need for that in some respects has gone down because, you know, it's been a standard in states that if you're going to be out of town on business, for example, or vacation election day, you could vote through absentee ballot. With the fact that the vast majority of states now have early voting going on for weeks before election day, that's not as much of a need. So I'm the first to tell you, you know, we should have the absentee balloting process, but we need to be very careful with it for the reason that, look, absentee ballots are the only kind of balloting and voting that's done outside the supervision of election officials, and also very importantly, outside the observation of observers of all of the parties and also nonprofit organizations. And if you look through our database, you'll find that unfortunately, absentee ballots are often the targets of people who want to cheat in elections because they're the easiest ballots to steal. They're the easiest ballots where voters can be intimidated and coerced in their homes because there's nobody there to observe it and say anything about it. And I actually, about 10 years ago, the New York Times wrote a piece about this and about the risks associated with absentee ballots. I mean, the final thing about them to keep in mind, and fortunately, this is being fixed in many states, is, look, if you make a mistake in the polling place with a ballot, you have the ability to go up to the election official. They can void your ballot. They can give you another one, and you can vote. If you make a mistake in your absentee ballot, your ballot may not get counted. Now, states are starting to try to fix that with what they call cure laws. Texas passed one, Georgia passed one, other states have it. So if an absentee ballot comes in and there's a mistake, the voter forgot to sign it, the election officials now are supposed to call the voter, contact the voter and say, look, there's an error. Do you want to come in and fix it? But while we need them, there should not be massive promotion of them so that we switch entirely to that kind of a system. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. The final one that I'll tell you, and this also applies to early voting. Voters love early voting, and I understand why it's convenient. But the problem is, particularly in primaries, look, the problem with early voting and voting weeks before an election is that, one, if some kind of news or information comes out right before the election that makes you change your mind, you're not going to be able to change your vote. And a prime example of this was the 2020 election. You all may recall there were how many candidates in the Democratic field? A lot. Well, right before Super Tuesday, two of the candidates got out 1 day and 2 days before Super Tuesday. Hundreds of thousands of people had voted in Democratic primaries all over the country for Super Tuesday and had voted for those two candidates who were no longer in the race, which meant they had wasted their votes. And that's one of the problems with voting early. And it's something people should keep in mind. By the way, the polling on this shows that voters think that having 2 weeks before election day is the amount of time needed for early voting. They don't like the idea of early voting going on even further back than that. So I don't have a problem with early voting. I just don't think it ought to be stretched out so far before the election that when you guys have heard the term an October surprise, right? I don't think they should be stretched out so far that people, if news comes in about a candidate, something that's going to make them change their mind, they don't have a chance to change who they voted for.
John?
I'll try to keep my answer short. Some of this, Hans and I agree on. Absolutely, there should be mail voting available. Absolutely, things like cure processes are critical and states should have them. I have nothing bad to say about early voting. I have no reason to think any state should not have early voting. States should have early voting. Hans is right that sometimes you cast a ballot early and something happens after the fact. Say it's relatively rare and it's something voters need to take into account, but I'd rather have voting available to people who aren't going to be able to vote later in the process than that kind of risk. On mail voting, I would just reiterate that just like with in-person voting, the rates of fraud committed in absentee or mail voting are infinitesimally small. There are states that have for many years had universal vote by mail elections, and they don't have some large scale of fraud compared to other states. They've been doing it just fine. I think that this is actually a conversation that is sort of the perfect example of how people's views being motivated by recent events in politics and race and other things. And I don't mean that. Hans, I think, has taken a very consistent position on mail voting for many years, so I commend him for that. But many people in this country changed their mind about mail voting and what they thought about it, and whether they thought that it was rife with fraud after who was voting by mail changed very significantly in 2020. It used to be a form of voting that was much more popular with Republican voters and older white voters. And then we had a pandemic and everybody was voting by mail, and the political parties were both engaged in all kinds of rhetoric about voting by mail one way or the other. And elections were decided by mail voters who didn't look like the mail voters of the past. And all of a sudden, many people had all kinds of things to say about rampant fraud in mail voting. So I think I would just encourage people not to form their opinion about these kinds of policies based on that kind of political rhetoric following an election, but rather on the facts.
Now, I've tried to blend some student questions in along the way, but we do want to make sure there is time for questions from the floor. We've got 2 people with microphones. If you'll raise your hands, they'll try to get to you.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay. As we're doing this, I just want to call your attention to one thing. There is an evaluation on your table. So you don't need to do it now, but make sure you do it before you leave. We want to keep informing how well we're doing. All right, you ready?
And let us know who you are as you take the mic.
Hi, my name is Thomas. My questions are for Mr. von Spakovsky about your employer.
You get 5 brownie points for pronouncing my name correctly.
Oh, thank you. I'll take those. About your employer, the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation has made a plan of policy recommendations for a hypothetical incoming Republican administration called Project 2025. Among those recommendations are the proposal to increase fossil fuel use and essentially shut down the EPA and the Department of Energy. And you have mentioned that you went to a science and engineering school. Like, my questions for you are, first, do you support those policy recommendations? And second, how could you assure students that your arguments about election integrity are made in good faith and not merely an attempt to advance corporate or partisan interests? Thank you.
Project 2025 is not for Republican presidents, for any new incoming, and any president comes into 2024. What he's talking about is that we've put together this book. It's about this thick. It has chapters on each of the major cabinet agencies like DOD, Energy, etc. And it has it's written by a lot of different people. It has recommendations on the policies that we think should be put in. I'm not the energy expert, so that's the wrong question for me. I wrote the chapter on the Federal Election Commission, where I was a commissioner. So we got a question about that. I'll be happy to answer it. Look, on the election integrity issue, what I'll say about that is Sean was right about one thing, which is, we spent a lot of time talking about voter ID, but there's a lot of different things that need to be done. And if you want to get an idea of what we think, what I think ought to be done is check out another database that we have on our website. It's called the Election Integrity Scorecard. And what we did is we came up with not one, but 47 different best practices criteria for states. And it covers everything from requiring an ID to vote and how to do that, including providing a free ID, to how you should maintain accurate voter rolls, okay? And gives all of our recommendations on this. As to helping the corporate world, actually, something like 98% of our donations come from individuals. Okay, we don't take big amounts of money from corporations, and we don't take any money from any government entities of any kind. And I can tell you, if I have never in my entire career at Heritage had anybody come to me that works there and say, you need to take this position because this is going to make some company happy. I'm asked as an analyst to look at problems and based on my experience, come up with what I think are solutions. And I don't know anybody else that does that there either. So,
Tasha, do you have a question?
Hi, my name is Jocelyn. It's a question for anyone,
That-
but
It's not on.
can you put the mic a little closer?
closer, like that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So my name is Jocelyn. This is a question for any of the panelists, really. So I come from a state with mail-in voting, like universal mail-in voting. So it's a completely foreign concept of me to stand in a poll line. And growing up, voting was always a part of the conversation at home. Like, this is democracy, you should be a part of it. So I wonder just what the case for poll voting is. Because
Sorry, the case for what?
Voting
For
in
poll
person at the
voting.
polls.
Voting in person?
yeah, because we always talk about why we shouldn't have mail-in voting, but why should we have poll voting?
I can give we probably both have an answer. You want to go first?
Well, if you're asking me why voting in person is a good thing, basically, I'll tell you a couple of things about that. One, look, if you want people to turn out to vote, I think part of what you have to do is inculcate the idea that voting is important in the young. And I will tell you that I think the best way to do that is when people go into a polling place, you have the whole community showing up to vote, and people are taking their kids with them to show them how important that is. That was really important in my life because I'm a first generation American, okay? My mother grew up in Nazi Germany. My father was a Russian who escaped communism. They met in a refugee camp. And when they became US citizens, they took us with them to tell us how important our right to vote was. And I think in-person voting helps kind of, like I said, inculcate that civic responsibility. But not only that, but transparency is really important in elections. And it's hard to have transparency when people are voting by the mail in their homes and you've got no election officials supervising it, and neither the parties nor the candidates nor third-party organizations can observe the voting process and make sure that people aren't being intimidated, coerced, or otherwise influenced and pressured to vote a particular way. So I think we should, as much as possible, encourage in-person voting for that and many other reasons.
I have a slightly different answer, but I agree with a lot of what Han said. And by that, I mean, I think that speaking personally as someone who has mostly voted in person, though I have recently voted by mail a couple of times, I enjoy the experience of going into a polling place with my fellow community members and engaging in democracy together. And I think it's fantastic that you grew up in a household where you were encouraged maybe around the living room table to see how, to engage in democracy. Not everybody gets that experience growing up, and there is something to sort of like a community gathering and participatory event. I think that there are things available to voters in the polls that aren't necessarily available to them at home. Sometimes voting is more accessible for folks with disabilities at home, and they can get the assistance they need there. But sometimes people go into a polling place in order to get the assistance that they need, whether because of a disability or a limited English proficiency or other things. I do agree that there's a value in transparency in elections. I don't think that means that there isn't transparency or that we have something to worry about in universal vote by mail elections, to be clear. But I agree with a lot of the principles behind what Hans just said. I think that we should make both forms and many forms of voting available to as many people as possible. And I think that in a lot of the states that have universal vote by mail, you actually find that a lot of people fill their ballots out at home, but then bring them into a polling place to drop them off because people do enjoy that experience. I think that's great. The last thing I'll say on this is just that there are some states in this country that I think are not quite ready to have universal vote by mail. They don't have the infrastructure in place. They have issues, like where I live, there's issues with the postal service in New York City that make me a little bit wary about switching to that right away. And so, I don't think we're ready to just like flick a switch and tomorrow everyone will be universal vote by mail either.
Okay, let's work to get as many in as we can. So short questions, actual questions, back to this side of the room. We got a lot of people in the middle here who have.
And it means you want us to give short answers.
Yeah, we're struggling with that.
How nice of you to volunteer that instruction.
So my name is Arthur. I'm from Missouri, and I have a question to both panelists. So GOP candidate Vivek Ramaswamy proposed a way to secure integrity of the elections. It would be single day voting, election day as a holiday, paper ballots, and government issued ID matching the voter file. What do you think that would actually secure elections?
Sean, that should go to you first.
All right. No, I don't. I think there's a mix of policies in there. I would say single day voting is a bad idea. I think that's important. I think we've made a lot of progress in recent years providing people opportunities besides election day to vote, because people aren't always available on election day to go vote. Making election day a holiday is great, but does not solve that problem, because the reality is that when election day is a holiday, people not me, because Hans and I probably are always working on election day, but people who have jobs that give them holidays off, that's great. Those aren't usually the people that are having a hard time turning out to vote in the first place. People who work an hourly shift at a department store, that's the day they're going to have to work because they're going to be a holiday sale that day. And a million other reasons. As someone with a small child, I can tell you, like, having one day that you need to do a thing, it's not always that easy to pull off when you have childcare responsibilities and other things. So I don't think that election day as a holiday cures the problem of single day voting. I think that paper ballots are a good thing. I think that elections, that all votes should have a voter verified paper trail, at least. That doesn't mean they have to be paper ballots. We want to have elections be accessible to people with disabilities, and sometimes that means ballot marking devices or other machines that make them accessible. But I do think there should be a voter verified paper trail so that we can audit elections after the fact. I think that's a good proposal, but I don't think it's like a panacea that solves all the problems. What was the last one? I don't remember what the last one is.
Profile.
I mean, you've heard my perspective on ID. I certainly don't think that we're not opposed to voter ID laws as a general matter. As I said, it's about the specifics. But I don't think that policy or any of those policies is the thing that's going to solve our elections. And to be clear, I don't think we are in a place where I actually do think we have integrity in our elections. I think there are ways that we can improve, but this isn't some crisis that needs to be solved either. There are things wrong with our democracy and things we need to fix, but I don't think those policies are actually aimed at addressing problems.
Tasha?
Sorry if I prevented you.
No.
Oh, great. Hi, Matt Borelli, 6-year PhD candidate, chemical engineering. So my question for you is, I would call it the elephant in the room, the thing that we didn't talk about, which is the problem with public confidence. As Hans said, a lot of candidates have been claiming if they lose, fraud. you indicated, Sean, that that's one of your three pillars that's important for a healthy democracy.
Mhm.
What are we doing about that? What can be done? And the thing that I think about immediately, right, which is usually the problem, is freedom of speech, right? But we have laws against saying fire in a crowded movie theater. And I think that something along those lines, and I'd like to kind of get each of your takes on that.
I think the push by folks to put in some kind of, for example, government censorship of what they consider to be misinformation or disinformation is one of the most dangerous developments we've had in this country in a long time. All right, and I say that as a former government bureaucrat, okay? I spent 4 years at the Justice Department, 2 years at the Federal Election Commission, where, as one of 6 commissioners, you know, the FEC, if you don't know how it works, has 3 Republican, 3 Democratic commissioners, and they run the agency. And look, I give lots of credit to the other, all the commissioners, no matter which party they were. They were trying to do the right thing. But we would often get into real arguments about political messaging and whether it fell into one category or another, and whether it fit within the regulations, regulatory authority of the FEC. And I can tell you, you do not want government making decisions on what people are allowed to say, because what one person considers misinformation, someone else may consider to not be misinformation. And one of the most dangerous developments in the last few years was, if you haven't seen it, you should read it, the district court opinion of the 2 states who sued the federal government. And they detail, the court order details page after page after page of government agencies contacting, pressuring, trying to coerce social media companies to censor information, not just on elections, but on all kinds of topics. And I'm telling you, that is dangerous. The answer to misinformation, if a government agency, say the FBI or somebody, believes that somebody is putting out something they don't think is right, put out a press release and dispute it, okay? Don't do it secretly behind the scenes, because the free flow of information is important to maintaining our democratic republic. It is vital to doing it. And you don't want major organizations, especially social media companies, censoring information and things, opinions that they don't like, because that's the road down, that's the road to tyranny. And I don't say that lightly. But that kind of censorship is extremely dangerous, and it's something we should all be against. It doesn't matter which political party you support, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, you should be against that happening in this nation. Like I said, the answer to speech you don't like or speech you think is wrong is more speech.
Should we all be opposed to disinformation in the same way? And what do you think about the circumstances that we're in when people who know better won't speak up?
Well, you know, the problem with disinformation brings up a very old saying that I think goes back to Roman times of who will guard against the guardians? Okay, and what you might consider disinformation today, years down the road, people will consider to have been correct. That happens in science, in technology all the time. People say, oh, that's impossible. And then later developments come up saying, actually, no, that is possible. And at the time, people said, well, that's just disinformation. There's no way you could actually do that. That happens all the time in our culture and society. And like I said, the answer to any of that is, you know, if you think information people are putting out is wrong, then put out the information you think is correct.
Sean, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I would that very last point, I think we agree about, which is you know, there's no great answer to disinformation, but perhaps the best answer is to put out as much of the accurate information as possible and to try to make it clear to people that that's trustworthy. So one of the pieces of the Freedom to Vote Act that I mentioned earlier is something called the Deceptive Practices in Voter Intimidation Prevention Act that I hope Congress will one day pass. And one of the things that it does is it says if there is deceptive information about our elections being circulated, that it's incumbent on the Department of Justice and the Attorney General to take corrective action and to put out corrective information. And so I agree that that's, maybe it's, cold comfort, but that's probably sort of the best answer we have in a lot of circumstances. But I will also say, I agree that this is, a big problem that we have. I don't, to be clear, first of all, I don't think that what happened in 2020 is indicative of what happens in every election with a sore loser. I think it was fundamentally different. I do agree that there were lies told after the 2016 election about that election, including from the winner, right, who said that he would have won the popular vote if it weren't for the millions of non-citizens that cast ballots, which is just a blatant lie, right? He was undermining public faith in our elections even when he was winning. It's not just about a sore loser complex. It's about attacks on the very notion of having a democracy. What happened in 2020 wasn't just a person being a sore loser. It was someone trying in a very coordinated way to try to overturn the outcome and take power when he lost an election. And I agree that we have to be very, very careful about persecuting and prosecuting speech. And I've litigated many First Amendment cases in my career. I'm a strong proponent of free speech. I believe very much the same about free speech as Hans does. But as you say, there are times when things cross the line. I'm not talking about a tweet here or there. But right now, Donald Trump is being prosecuted for committing acts which were intended to overturn the outcome of a presidential election. And some of those acts involve speech, but that doesn't mean that they're immune from prosecution, right? This is a thing that's been said a lot in public. Well, he was just saying things and that's free speech. Like just this term, the US Supreme Court ruled in a case about criminal solicitation where someone challenged the idea that they could be prosecuted for soliciting a crime because that was a violation of their free speech rights. This is a regular occurrence. People in this country are regularly prosecuted for committing crimes through speech. If you solicit someone to do a terrible thing with your words, you can be prosecuted for committing a crime. If you use your words to try to convince people to overturn the outcome of an election, you can be prosecuted for that. And we're not in danger of running afoul of the First Amendment there. We are in danger of running afoul of the First Amendment if we just censor people's opinions about the outcome of elections. This is fundamentally different than that, and it is fundamentally different than what we've seen in previous elections. And I don't think we should gloss over it as if it were the same thing that we've seen time and time again. It was not.
Can I just say, we need to have another hour to come back to have a debate about the First Amendment. I just want to add a historical note here. And you all should realize there was a book came out about 10 years ago. I think it was called First Salute. You may remember this book. Look, if you think things are bad today in the political realm, right? There's just misinformation and people are saying things that are lies. You should read this book. This book is about the earliest political campaigns after the year 1800, right? Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, when the newspapers that were in the United States were party organizations, right? If you were a newspaper, you were the newspaper of one political party or the other. And if you want to see misinformation and outright lies being told about the candidates, you should read this book. If you think this is something new today, no, it's not. It's something that's been present throughout our history. And I don't think people back then actually thought, yeah, you should censor it. You should censor that kind of thing. And Congress passed a law. It was called the Alien and Sedition Acts. And we realized that that was not only unconstitutional, but it was bad policy to put in federal laws censoring speech, particularly about politicians and people in office. So
I agree, by the way, that lying by politicians is nothing new. That has been going on since the beginning of time and will always go on. But it is actually unprecedented in our country for the sitting president of the United States to encourage people to attack our nation's capital in a violent insurrection. And so that's what I mean by this is not something that has happened before. And that holding people accountable for that does not put us in danger of losing the right to free speech.
I apologize to those who have their hands in the air. Some of you deserve medals for keeping them up for so long. But we're essentially at 6 o'clock. I will try to impose upon our speakers to stay for a little bit and talk to you if you have questions you'd like to put to them individually. But I'd also like to give them each a minute or two to sum up if there are points they had hoped to make that they haven't had the chance to yet. And Hans, I think you're first again.
Look, I'm not gonna sum up. You've heard all the arguments and issues that we've talked about today. What I will end with is what I started with, okay, which is there's this growing trend in this country to think that if someone is saying something you disagree with, they should not be allowed to speak. Or if someone is saying something publicly that you disagree with, that you have a heckler's veto. And that is a bad trend, is a dangerous trend that imperils our democratic system. There's our whole democratic system. And frankly, the university system, where this is in colleges all over the country, this is really getting bad, where our whole system depends on the free flow of ideas. Not only the free flow of ideas, but people debating often contentious issues and being willing to speak up about it. I hope all of you, when you're going to classes and folks in your classes are saying things that you disagree with, or your professor says something you disagree with, I hope you are not intimidated and are afraid to speak up. Because I don't care which side of the political aisle you're on, it's important that you speak up and that we bring back this idea that the First Amendment flows everywhere in this country, not just in the political realm, but also in the college systems and in the classrooms where you work. Because without that, we are not going to be able to preserve our democratic republic.
Sean?
I agree with all of that. And I think that today is a great example of exactly the kind of conversations that we've all been talking about. I just I'm going to keep my comments super short because we're running late and I have another meeting, but thank you to the Institute of Politics for having this kind of conversation, because I agree that we have to be able to have these kinds of conversations. It is critical to our democracy. And I, again, commend you all for being here. I'm happy to stick around for a couple minutes if people have additional questions, but I'm unfortunately probably going to have to run pretty soon. Thank you.
Samantha would want me to remind you about the survey. And I want to let you know that the Dick Thornburg Forum for Law and Public Policy presents through the year series of programs on governance, including preserving democracy. We have 3 programs coming up this fall. On October 5th at 4 o'clock here, Caitlin Polantz, who is the senior crime and justice reporter for CNN, and also a Pitt graduate, and also a former editor-in-chief of the Pitt News, will be here to talk about the critical role played by the media in preserving democracy. On November 8th, the day after the elections, we're going to do a program with a group called Keep Our Republic, which has 3 very straightforward principles it seeks to advance. Let every eligible voter vote, let the votes be counted, and let the electoral count stand. Included in the panel that night will be former Governor Corbett, as well as people from the Democratic side of the aisle. And on November 28th, Professor Lisa Nelson from the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs will be talking about anger, radicalization, and violence as threats to American democracy based on work that she is doing. I want to thank all of you for being here, and I hope you will join me in thanking Hans and Sean for making this program at the University of Pittsburgh possible.